We're going to start 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6 in particular, but I'll read down to verse 8. Starting in verse 6. Your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened, for indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Okay, so 1 Corinthians 5 is talking about this situation in which there was a person in the church who was in unrepentant sin, sexual immorality. And Paul says, listen, you're glorying over this thing, you're acting like it's no big deal, and it is a big deal. You should discipline this fellow. If he's not willing to listen to the elders and listen to the church, he should be put out. And so this is really a moral issue. But here's what he says about it. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. In other words, you take it easy on this person. You say, well, we'll just let this one slide. Well, the leaven spreads. And he uses this illustration of leaven, of yeast, which a little bit of it works its way through the whole dough. And that's the image. And that's oftentimes in the Bible used for sin. Sin has a corrupting influence. A little bit of it doesn't just stay in its own little corner. It spreads and grows. Just like we talk about a lie. A lie produces other lies, and it expands and grows. That's the way sin works. And so he's basing his reasoning. He says, listen, you need to get this man out of your congregation. You don't let him remain if he won't repent, because he's a corrupting influence. Now, this applies, I think, not only to moral corruption, but also to doctrinal corruption. The same principle applies. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. In other words, if you tolerate some error, theological error, biblical error, then you are opening the door to other errors, and it's going to grow, and it's going to continue to spread. And so there needs to be, Paul says, a decisive break from this corrupting influence. And that's exactly something that the fundamentalists in the early 20th century said, that we cannot tolerate a little liberalism because it's going to leaven the whole lump. And so it needs to go, or we need to go. Now, initially, the fundamentalists were saying, let's reclaim our denominations. A liberalism has sneaked in. Let's crush it. Let's get it out. Let's try and solve this problem. Later on, and this is what we're going to see tonight, liberalism, that leaven spread, and it basically took over the whole lump of the denomination. And eventually the conservatives said to themselves, we can't abide with this. We cannot stay here. So if they're not going to change, then we are going to have to leave, because we cannot. What fellowship can light have with darkness? And so that's where we're going to come to tonight with the denominational splits that happen. And really, we're getting close to the end. I think we'll wrap it up next time, and you'll want to be here next week if you can be, because we're going to sort of recap with some lessons, some big picture stuff about fundamentalism, and then where it went afterwards. So that'll be a very worthwhile discussion, I think. But that's not to say tonight's not important. Well, next week's really important. This is just this is important too, because this is where it's all been heading. This is where we reach the climax. Now, last time we talked about the Scopes trial. You remember that? The monkey trial? And it was sort of a fiasco. It was a media circus. It was all trumped up to be this big event. And ultimately, at the high point of or if you could say, maybe I should say low point of the trial, Clarence Darrow gets William Jennings Bryan on the stand of the Scopes trial and starts questioning him on the Bible. And his questions are kind of sneaky, the way they're phrased and the way they're put, because he tries to make William Jennings Bryan look like an idiot for taking the Bible literally. You think a snake talked to a woman? Come on, let's get real. This is the 20th century, that sort of thing. And what we said last time is before 1925 in the Scopes trial, American attitudes towards fundamentalism were pretty positive. They felt like, I mean, if people cared at all, which a lot of Americans didn't care about what was going on in the denominations, but if they cared at all, they probably sided with the fundamentalists. Not so after 1925. Things shift. It seems that fundamentalists are just oafish, they're science deniers, they're ignorant, and it was all kind of put on display at the Scopes trial. So American attitudes turned pretty sharply against fundamentalists in post-1925. We're going to jump around as far as dates today, but we are going to follow through what happened and how the split occurred, kind of taking it full circle now. So number one, liberals seize, and get this, total control of mainline denominations. And I phrase it that way for a reason, because, probably prior to this, they already had control, but it was still kind of split. Just like you might say today, the Republicans have control of the Congress, or the Democrats have control of the Congress. Well, it's kind of split. They just have a slight majority. Well, when I say total control, the liberals have basically taken over. They run the denomination now. There may still be some conservatives around, but their voice is pretty much squashed. The liberals are the ones who are making the decisions. So I'm going to talk through this, and we're going to go through basically the Presbyterians and the Baptists again. I know we've talked about them before, so we've talked mostly so far in the study about the Presbyterians, because that's where a lot of the action was, as far as Princeton Seminary and J. Gresham Machen and that kind of thing. So I'm going to go quick with the Presbyterians, and we're going to get on to the Baptists tonight, just to switch it up. So the Northern Presbyterians, how was it that the liberals finally gained victory? Well, number one is the Auburn Affirmations. So Auburn, A-U-B-U-R-N-E, U-R-N, excuse me, no E. And, Auburn, New York is where the conference was. So they came up with the Auburn Affirmation, which basically said, we understand the fundamentals, and that, the fundamentalists have been harping on it. These are the things you must believe to be a Christian. And so the Auburn Affirmation said, yes, we agree. You must believe those things. You've got to believe in inspiration. But we don't assume there's one theory of inspiration. In other words, there may be multiple theories for how inspiration works. So yeah, we're all going to accept the fundamentals. We'll all accept these things, but we'll open the door by saying we accept various theories on them, like the virgin birth. Okay, your idea of the virgin birth is that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary, supernaturally. Okay, well, I happen to have a different theory about it. That, maybe God used a human father somehow. Totally disagrees with what the Bible says, of course, but that's my theory. So they said, yeah, we'll affirm. Yeah, we believe in miracles. We believe in inspiration, all these things, but we accept different theories about it. So it was kind of a slick little way to undercut the fundamentals. Do you see what they're doing? And then finally, it kind of reaches ahead in number two, the expulsion of Machen, M-A-C-H-E-N. So J. Gresham Machen. Here, this is an irony, okay? So Machen was going around saying, listen, liberalism is not Christianity. We are a Christian denomination, ergo, we cannot allow liberalism, because it totally denies everything we hold to and believe. And the liberals, what did they say? We need to be open and accepting and broad-minded. We need to not be so narrow as J. Gresham Machen is saying we should be. We need to be broad-minded and willing to accept different viewpoints. Well, here's the irony, is that towards the end of about 1930, coming up to 1930, they the denomination that is, absolutely vilified Machen. So I guess they were willing to accept all viewpoints except for his. Isn't that how broad-minded progressives oftentimes go? We want to be accepting of all except for your viewpoint. That's totally intolerable. We cannot put up with that. And so they made Machen out to be this horrible offender, and we need to, eventually he was defrocked, which means they took away his ordination and stripped him of essentially of his credentials in the Northern Presbytery. Of course, that didn't stop him. Machen just went across the river and started a new seminary and eventually started a new denomination of Presbyterians. So that's the split finally happened. Machen did not want to leave, but he saw that he was forced to leave because they were no longer willing to accept biblical Christianity. And he took off and created some organizations we'll talk about here in a minute. That was the split that happened in the Northern Presbyterians. Any questions on that? Okay, we've talked about some of that before. Letter B is the Northern Baptist Convention. Today, they are known as the American Baptists. So if you ever hear of that, American Baptist Church, back then it was known as the Northern Baptist Convention, as opposed to, the Southern Baptist Convention. You got the Southern Baptists and the Northern Baptists. The whole convention was formed in 1907, so it was fairly new, but it had liberalism in it from the get-go. The Chicago School of Divinity was one of their chief schools of the Northern Baptist. Chicago School of Divinity is about as liberal as they come. It's horrible. There were a couple of warning signs. Number one, that bad things were on the horizon and that the liberals were about to gain a foothold. In 1919, you have letter A, the New World Movement. And right there, that ought to throw up some red flags, right? New World. Well, what happened in 1919? What was going on in world politics? Do you know?
I wasn't born yet. I'm old.
Yeah, so World War I was just coming to an end. And they were engaged. The Germans had basically surrendered, and there was a big Paris peace talks, which were coming up in 1919 to 1920. So, in World War I, we forget because we're 100 years separated from it, but World War I was really terrible war. And it kind of has been overshadowed by World War II because it also was a really terrible war. But the people called it the war to end all wars for a reason, because it just was so unbelievably devastating. You had the chemical warfare for the first time, mechanized infantry. You had tanks and airplanes employed in warfare for the first time. And machine guns first implemented, which just killed literally millions of people across the European continent. Europe was just devastated. So, in 1919, this New World movement was sort of a ecumenical, basically humanitarian movement. In other words, it was Catholics and evangelicals, and basically everybody was going to hold hands to help rebuild Europe and do social, humanitarian work and all this kind of thing. Well, the conservatives in the Northern Baptist Convention were a little concerned about this. They said, isn't our mission to be going out and preaching the gospel? And this was just basically a social gospel thing, which it might be helpful to note. Walter Rauschenbusch, who was basically the author of the social gospel, in fact, he authored a book called The Social Gospel, was in the Northern Baptist Convention, so no big surprise. But conservatives saw it as, this is not a direction we want to go in, uniting with Catholics and various other groups, and getting off track into sort of the social gospel world. Letter B, there's also the issue of, guess who? Harry Emerson Fosdick. We talked about him a couple of weeks ago. And Fosdick is just, he was the most popular preacher in America, practically. And he was a liberal. He originally was preaching in a Presbyterian church in New York, but then he switched to a Baptist church. And so basically the Baptists, and it was a Northern Baptist church. So the Baptists were all kind of like, what do we do with this guy? So all the conservatives said, he needs to go. He clearly is a liberal. He doesn't agree with, he's not biblical. We need to get him out. The liberals, of course, said, no, we should keep him. And so this was sort of a back and forth. Do we keep him? Do we let him go? Well, ultimately, he never left, right? So the liberals obviously had enough traction and enough influence to say, no, he stays. And so these were the warning signs that, like, okay, we can see where this, I mean, if our denomination is jumping in with this New World movement, and if our denomination is standing by Harry Emerson Fosdick, it's not headed in a great direction. During this time, and we'll talk about this in a few moments, there was also some fundamentalist organizations created within the Northern Baptists to try and basically hold the line against this liberal direction. And then number two is the controversy over the New Hampshire Baptist Confession. Okay, so 1922, the Northern Baptist Convention is held in Indianapolis. And all the delegates and everybody's there. And William Bell Riley, who's a fundamentalist, W.B. Riley, stands up and he proposes, he says, listen, what we should adopt, we should vote as a denomination to adopt the New Hampshire Baptist Confession as our, in other words, everybody has to sign this Baptist Confession, which, I don't think I've ever read it, but it was just a Baptist confession. In other words, you have to believe the Trinity, you have to believe in the virgin birth, you have to believe in the inspiration of the scriptures, and so on. Basically, Christian Baptist belief, nothing crazy. And another guy stands up, who's another delegate there, and his name is Cornelius Wolfkin. What a great name. Cornelius Wolfkin stands up and says, no, I have a counter proposal. I say we need no creed except the New Testament. Now, how can you argue with that? I mean, of course we believe the New Testament. Of course that should be our creed, right? But what he was going to say, the reason he did it was to derail. In other words, we don't need this Baptist confession. We're going to believe just the Bible. Well, whose interpretation of the Bible? And clearly the liberals wanted to leave it open for everybody, whereas if they adopted the New Hampshire Confession, it kind of tightened it. In other words, we believe the Bible teaches these things. Whereas they would say, oh, I believe the Bible, of course I do. I just don't think that it teaches the virgin birth or miracles or deity of Christ or, any of these things. So it was a good ploy on their part, right? Because even the conservatives, some of the conservatives went over and voted with Wolfkin. Because, who wants to go against the New Testament? I mean, it looks bad if you vote against it, right? I mean, because it sounds like you're saying, well, I don't think the New Testament should be our guide for doctrine. Of course it should be. But what ended up happening is they voted down the New Hampshire Confession. And that was kind of the beginning of the end for the Northern Baptists. At that point, the conservatives never won any victories. In fact, that wasn't a victory either. But from that point on, it was basically a liberal takeover of the denomination, and there was virtually no stopping it. Let's stop there for a second. Because I see this as a strategy that's employed very often today by, not just by liberals, but just in the world of theology or even in culture, where we'll sort of substitute one thing for another. And it sounds like, it's kind of like a group says, well, I'm against the Second Amendment. I'm against citizens having guns because guns are used to shoot kids in schools. And so if you say, no, I'm actually for citizens having guns, then are you for kids getting murdered? That's sort of the ploy, right? And that's just one example. We could use others. But it's that line of argument. In other words, I'm going to frame it in such a way that you can't disagree with me without sounding like you disagree with, you think children should die in schools. Or in this case, if you disagree, it sounds like you're against the New Testament. And I think we ought to call that argument out when we see it. Whenever someone kind of builds a false dichotomy, in other words, well, in order to you have to agree with me if you think the New Testament is worthwhile. No, I certainly believe the New Testament, but you're making, you're conflating these things. You're making your argument synonymous with the New Testament. That's not true. All right, number two, the fundamentalists form their own fellowships and organizations. So when it's clear that the denominations are tanking and they're going liberal, the fundamentalists eventually have to make a split and say, nope, we can't stay here. We're going to form our own schools. We're going to form our own missions organizations. We're going to form our own even denominations or fellowships. They tended to be fellowships, maybe more than denominations. So let's look at a few examples of this. Letter A is the Presbyterians. We'll start with them again. I won't spend much time here, but number one is the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. That's formed by J. Gresham Machen. When he finally gets kicked out of the Presbyterian Church, he starts the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Well, pretty early on, there's a split, and it forms, number two, the Bible Presbyterian Church. And I don't really know all the details of the split. I mean, you could look it up, but I'm not going to go into it right now. The point is they didn't stay together very long. Early on, the Bible Presbyterians broke off. But they would have been both, at least initially, would have been considered fundamentalist denominations. Here's an interesting little thing, and maybe nobody will know this. Who was the first person to be ordained a Bible Presbyterian in the Bible Presbyterian? Francis Schaeffer. He was actually one of sort of an apologist and philosopher, Bible teacher. He was really important in the pro-life movement in kind of launching the defense of the unborn. Anyway, so that's the Presbyterians. The Orthodox, the Bible Presbyterian Church was sort of the denominations that were started as a result of that. All right, letter B is the Baptist groups. And first, we're going to talk about the Fundamentalist Fellowship, which formed in 1920. So actually before the exodus from the denomination. It later became known as the Conservative Baptist Fellowship, and you can write that in if you want, but later on it was known as the Conservative Baptist Fellowship. A few of the names associated with it: J.C. Massey, A.C. Dixon, and there's William Bell Riley again. He was the guy that presented the New Hampshire Confession. By the way, that's William Bell Riley right there in the picture. Obviously, this is at the end of his life or near it. But he was longtime pastor of the First Baptist Church in Minneapolis, and was one of the key fundamentalist leaders against modernism, and one of the better leaders against modernism, I might say. Not flawless, but... All right, so the Fundamentalist Fellowship starts in 1920. Here's the deal. The convention was coming up for the Northern Baptists, and the Fundamentalists said, hey, we're all coming to, I forget which city it was in, but we're all coming to, Buffalo, New York, or wherever it was, and why don't we all come a few days early and have our own little fundamentalist meeting? All of us hardcore fundamentalists who are against modernism, we can have our own little meeting, basically a big, get each other pumped up so that when we go into the convention, we're ready to fight. So that's what they did. They showed up and had they had this fundamentalist fellowship where they all there were different people who preached different sermons, and they were all, against evolution, against modernism. One guy gave a presentation on how the Baptist seminaries had all gone liberal, and built the case against them. So it was sort of like a hoorah, rah, let's all get worked up because the convention's about to happen. Well, it started to become kind of their little club in which they would organize. Hey, next year at our Fundamentalist Fellowship, let's talk about what we can do to fight modernism in the denomination. And so it was like pre-convention. They would always have these little meetings. Now, number two, or letter B, excuse me, they took a soft, so the word there is soft, stance against liberalism. Now, they were fundamentalists, so it wasn't really soft. But compared to others, it was sort of they didn't want to leave the denomination. That was the big thing. They were willing to work with people who were willing to work with them. They wanted to get the denomination back on track. And so they were a little kinder, perhaps, a little softer, In fact, sadly, some of the people in the Fundamentalist Fellowship eventually kind of, I would say basically compromised later on, which led to number 2 on the backside, the Bible Baptist Union in 1923. So this was sort of the response, a kind of an alternate group. Same sort of thing. It was a club. It was a little less organized, actually. But this was the harder stance. These were the guys who said, no, there's no compromising. And they were eventually the ones who said, either we get our denomination back or we get out. Whereas the Fundamentalist Fellowship was a little more like, let's stick it out and see if we can work it out. Whereas the Bible Baptist Union was sort of like, we either get this or we go, one or the other. So it was a fundamentalist organization. Letter A, there were some problems even from the get-go with the Bible Baptist Union. And the first deals with strong personalities. So a lot of these fundamentalists, leaders in the Bible Baptist Union were, outspoken individuals to say the least. They had to have a bit of a fighting spirit to join this organization. Because if you were just sort of if you were if you were a more conciliatory fundamentalist, you would probably be in the Fundamentalist Fellowship. If you were just a kind of middler on the whole thing, you probably wouldn't have been a fundamentalist at all. So this was sort of not the extreme, but they were the fighting fundamentalists here in the Bible Baptist Union. And that led to a lot of clashes because, again, these people, strong opinions, some of them, sadly, and I say this not to their credit, had some pretty big egos. And, yeah, so it's kind of like when you get a bunch of leaders together in a room and everybody's trying to be the leader. That's essentially the part of the problem they had. So you have letter A, T.T. Shields. You notice, by the way, everybody's got these initials, right? T.T. Shields. He's born in 1873, dies in 1955. He's born, actually, in England. He's Canadian, though. He pastors the Jarvis Street Baptist Church in Toronto, Canada, for many, many years. He does a lot of... He's a fundamentalist. He's fighting modernism all the way. He's known affectionately as the Spurgeon of Canada. So that gives you an idea. He was quite the preacher. This might be the negative we see about T.T. Shields, though, is he was kind of an autocrat. I mean, he sort of micromanaged and ran everything. And he didn't necessarily share responsibility or share authority very well. I mean, everybody's got flaws. So I don't want to just single these people out, but I also want you to realize why the Baptist Bible Union had some problems, because you've got T.T. Shields who kind of, I mean, his church, he pretty much ran everything. And yeah, which actually is going to become one of the stereotypes, one of the negative holdovers for fundamentalism, is that fundamentalism in the years that follows has a reputation for pastors being kind of, yeah, they have all the say, and nobody questions, God's anointed and so on. Letter B is William B. Riley, or W.B. Riley. We talked about him already. He moved from the Fundamentalist Fellowship over to the Bible Baptist Union. He was, I already mentioned, he was the pastor of First Baptist Church in Minneapolis for many, many years, 45, I think, in all. And he was, as I see it, and I haven't read a ton about these men, but from what I understand, he was the most maybe reasonable. Like, he tended to be the voice of reason and sort of was, he was outspoken against modernism and things, but he also, he could also work with other people. Let's say it that way. Versus letter C, J. Frank Norris. J. Frank Norris. Who this guy was basically all the stereotypes of fundamentalist preachers go back to J. Frank Norris. Let's face it. He was in the South, so he was born in 1877, dies in 1952. Most of his ministry is at First Baptist Church in Fort Worth, Texas. And he's born, grows up in Texas, and he kind of has that Texas persona. Kind of a, we're going to do it my way, kind of big Texas oil man sort of attitude. He has a radio program. He has the largest church in America during the early 19, or at least for a while. So he's got a big congregation. Not to mention, and I don't understand this, but apparently he was pastor at First Baptist in Fort Worth at the same time he was pastor of a Baptist church in Detroit. I don't know how you preach in two different churches on a Sunday across the country before there's internet and telephone and, I guess there was telephones, but I'm not sure how that worked out. But I imagine, though, he was probably getting a paycheck from both churches. I'm not sure. So Norris, he's quite a preacher, but he's also quite the showman. He preaches a lot against, sins, cultural sins. So a lot of the stereotype, again, of fundamentalist preaching events, we're against this and we're against that. Norris sort of embodied that a little bit. He preached a very famous sermon titled Rum and Romanism. So it was against booze and Catholics. Okay. But like I said, he was quite the showman. I understand he preached a sermon one time where he actually brought, this was during the Prohibition, I think. He actually brought a couple of kegs of beer to this thing and then smashed them on stage, sort of this big demonstration. I don't know where he got beer during the Prohibition, but it probably was not legal. But he smashed it. He didn't drink it. That's all good. Another time he was preaching against evolution, another one of his favorite topics to preach against. And they had somehow rented a bunch of monkeys from the zoo so he could bring them out on stage as part of the sermon. So like I said, he was kind of a showman, very, sort of in the style of Billy Sunday almost. But he was also, by the end of his life especially, I think he may have gotten kind of hardened down on some things, but just a mean guy. So one of his biographers, Barry, I think, writes in the foreword. He wrote a biography of J. Frank Norris and basically says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says in the introduction to the biography, I really wanted to say some good things about Norris, but I couldn't find any. Basically he says, I tried really hard to be sympathetic, but he was just, he had a lot of character flaws. Now, for all of them, I think he was right on a lot of the issues. So his demeanor, his attitude, I think was all wrong on a lot of things. Even though, he was against evolution, for instance. Well, so am I. I just think a lot of times his demeanor and his attitude were not necessarily becoming. Which leads us to number 3. So they had problems with these strong personalities and clashes within the Bible Baptist Union. But then there's also this issue of number 2, the death of Dexter Chips.
What?
The death.
Oh, dead. Is he dead?
Yeah, he's dead. And this will maybe be even more revealing about Norris. So Norris preaches against Catholicism a lot. I mean, he sees Catholicism as a big problem. Well, the mayor of Fort Worth is a Catholic, Meacham by name. And so he preaches against, in one of his sermons, he insinuates and basically accuses the mayor of favoring Catholics, especially in his government decisions. He was giving them breaks on land and stuff to build Catholic schools. So he kind of accuses them, and it gets all over the newspapers, et cetera, and it becomes a big thing. Well, Dexter Chips is a friend of Meacham, and he's a big lumberman. He has a lumber mill and has big business in Fort Worth. Well, he gets into these discussions and actually supposedly threatens J. Frank Norris. Well, one day, Norris Chips comes into the church where Norris is, First Baptist in Fort Worth, and comes in. They have a yelling match basically in his office, and supposedly again, Chips threatens Norris. Well, according to Norris's story, Chips walks to the door, and right as he gets to the door, he flips around and he reaches behind him. Well, Norris has a .38 revolver in his desk. He draws and he fires 4 times, hits Chips, and later on that day, I think it was that day or the next, Chips dies. So pastor guns down lumberman in his office. How's that going to look, on the headlines? And you can believe it was all over the headlines. This is 1926. So Scandal City, there's a big investigation, and ultimately, Norris argues that it was self-defense. He thought this guy was in here threatening him, and he thought, he was turning around to draw a gun on him. And so I drew first and shot. Hey, it's Texas. And he eventually, he's not, I forget all the outcomes of the trial, but basically the self-defense argument stands. And there weren't any other witnesses, so... any rate, after that, Norris, a lot of people won't associate with Norris anymore. It's kind of like the scandals of televangelists in the 1980s and 90s. It's like once they kind of fall, it's like, okay, let's just not invite them in any more conferences. Just pretend they don't exist. Get them out of the public sight. So Norris kind of has a clouded reputation after that, and it doesn't do anything good for the Bible Baptist Union because he's the vice president of the organization. Guilt by association. Which, here's another interesting thing I learned. Apparently the same summer when Norris shot Chips in his office, there was also another court case going on in California. Anybody ever heard of Amy Semple McPherson before? All right, she was a charismatic preacher in California. And she was under investigation at that time for, because she had disappeared. It was really bizarro. It was in 1926. She disappeared for like 3 weeks or whatever it was, maybe a month. And she was a really popular preacher. She had a program that went all over America and stuff like this. And nobody knew where she was. And when she got back, she claimed that she had been kidnapped by some people and taken down to Mexico. And eventually she had escaped and made her way back. And she stuck with that story her whole life. But anyways, there was a big investigation. So this is a big summer for church scandals. You had Semple McPherson out in California. You have Norris in Texas. It's just a mess. So the whole idea of church religious scandals is not necessarily new. It's not the last 30 years or 40 years. It's been at least 100. Okay. Number 3 problem for the Baptist Bible Union that they run into is the Des Moines University debacle. Say Des Moines, like Des Moines, Iowa. DES space MOINES. This is another example, and this is again something that just hurts the reputation of the Bible Baptist Union. What happens is the Northern Baptist Convention has a school called the Des Moines University. And basically it's going bankrupt. It's a liberal, college. And so they're running out of money. They can't really keep it open. So the Northern Baptists offer it to the Bible Baptist Union. Say, listen, hey, if you want to buy this off of us, you can. And T.T. Shields in particular leads the charge on this. And basically he says, wouldn't this be great if we could take a liberal school, turn it around, and make it a fundamentalist school? That would just sort of be in your face, a victory for us fundamentalists. Well, it sounds great on paper, but how do you turn around a school that's already, because I think they assumed their debt when they bought it. So it turns into this big disaster. Number one, T.T. Shields is still preaching and, pastoring up in Toronto, even though he's he's the head of the board of directors. So there's a secretary, a lady named Edith Rebman, who is basically, she's the one who's doing all the work on the ground in Des Moines. She also is a Canadian, which is, we'll get to that in a minute. But she's the one who's kind of running stuff there. And And the whole thing is just, I don't know, it's just that's why I call it a debacle. It's just a mess. Like they hire a guy to be the president of the school. Well, it turns out later that a couple of his degrees might have been bogus degrees. Like he didn't actually earn them. It's like, oh no. And it's kind of one thing leads to another. Just problems all up and down in the school. So it's only open for about 3 years. And one of the problems too is that Shields and this Rebman are both Canadians running the school in America. And so they were actually at one point, and I read this, they were advocating like, we should sing God Save the Queen instead of the Star Spangled Banner, and all the students were like, what? and apparently Rebman, the secretary there, when they did play the national anthem, refused to stand up, because she was Canadian. She wasn't just like, oh dear. Well, eventually this all leads to a riot. I think it's in 1928. The students riot against the school, basically saying, and there were factions within the school that didn't like Shields or Rebman, and so they were kind of rabble-rousers who stirred it up. But nevertheless, there's a riot on campus. According to Rebman, she was run off campus, and she said her quote was, "The students had murder in their eyes." So she was like, "I'm getting out of here." And so at the end of that school year, they close, and they never reopen. So the whole thing's kind of just a disaster, and it wasn't necessarily any one person's fault. I mean, there's probably blame on various people. But the whole thing kind of, what could have been this great success story, we took a liberal school and we turned around, made it a fundamentalist school, turned into, they couldn't even keep it, open for 3 years. And so the Bible Baptist Union kind of starts off rough, let's just say that. But letter B, it eventually became the GARBC. So the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. Well, the GARBC was kind of it was a fellowship of churches, essentially, but it was kind of like a denomination, sort of Baptist. They all came out of the Northern Baptist Convention, and it started off, and it's a whole long story I'm not going to go into, because it's the same type of thing. Well, there was originally some Baptists in Ohio, and they started an organization, and they joined up with some Baptists in Michigan, and they changed their name, and then they joined up with some others, and they eventually changed their name again, yada yada yada. Eventually it ends up being the GARBC, which is around today. Letter B is the Independent Fundamental Churches of America, IFCA, which is grown out of this same time. Now, they don't come out of the Northern Baptist like the GARBC does. It actually starts with, it's, number one, founded in 1930. There are a group of pastors in Chicago area, particularly Cicero, Illinois. Cicero Bible Church is where a guy, number 2 there, it's blank, it's for Billy McCarroll. Billy McCarroll. McCarroll spelled McCarrell. When I was in college, the men's dorm on the college was McCarroll Hall, named after Billy McCarroll. But he's the pastor of Cicero Bible Church, and he's already decided to leave his denomination. He was part of a Congregationalist church, and a lot of his friends were part of Presbyterian denominations, various other ones that had all left because they've gone liberal. We can't tolerate that. And so they all left, and they were all independent churches now. They weren't tied to anybody. And so they kind of felt a little bit alone because they were used to going to these conferences or conventions, and they would see all their other pastor friends and stuff. And now they didn't have anybody. They were out just sort of floating out there. So they all got together and said, well, why don't we form a non-denominational fellowship, kind of an independent church group? We're not going to create an organization per se. Like, in other words, we're not going to have like one law to rule us all. Instead, we're going to each be independent churches, but let's still try and do stuff together. And so initially they started an organization that had a different name again, but the name they eventually settled on in 1930 was Independent Fundamental Churches of America. Now today, the organization is called IFCA International. The acronym has been dropped for 2 reasons. Number one, I think they switched it to just IFCA instead of Independent Fundamental Churches of America because, number one, the word fundamental has come to mean lots of things now, 100 years, almost 100 years later, 90 years later. The other thing is there are IFCA churches in Africa, in Australia, in Europe, so it's not really of America anymore. So they call it IFCA International. They kept the acronym, but dropped the lettering, the wording of it. And so number three, it's a non-denominational fellowship of churches, and that's where we belong to. That's kind of our heritage. Most of the IFCA churches are Bible churches. I'm not going to say all the time, but I would say a fair amount of the time, if you see a church called a Bible church, there's a good chance it's a IFCA church. Not always. Depends especially on where you are in the country. If you see a Bible church in North Carolina, for instance, it's probably not because there's not very many IFCA. I don't know why, but there are just not very many IFCA churches. But you don't have to be a Bible church to be IFCA. They're not. You may have a church called, Colonial Baptist Church in Cary, North Carolina, where I went to seminary, is not an IFCA church, but their pastor is an IFCA pastor. So you don't have to be a Bible church, but generally, I would say like 90% of IFCA churches are all called Bible churches. So I want to just point out that our heritage as a church, as far as our ministry connections, obviously our heritage goes back to the founding of this church, but our connection to the IFCA, we're connected with an organization that goes back to this time period, 90 years ago when these battles were being fought. All right, well, let's spend a little bit of time then on lessons. Actually, any questions on the IFCA or the Bible Baptist Union / GARBC? That's J. Frank Norris right there. Yeah, the gun-toting Texas preacher. Which, to his defense, and this is what he said, J. Frank Norris didn't normally carry a revolver. He just happened to have one at that particular time because he had, he was a high-profile person who said a lot of unpopular things, and so he got a lot of death threats, and he was getting them right now, so he had a gun in his drawer. But he got all kinds of nicknames from that event, like the gunslinging pastor and the shooting salvationist and some others. All right. Lessons then. Number one, right belief must always be combined with right character. And I appreciate some of these fundamentalists for what they stood for. But I mentioned that some of them were, the autocrats. They were, had big egos. J. Frank Norris being one of them. He seemed awfully proud that he was pastor of one of the biggest churches in America. And I feel like, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I feel as though a lot of the other fundamentalists were willing to overlook some of his character flaws because he was on their side. You know what I'm saying? In other words, yeah, he's saying the right things, so we're not going to worry about some of the things about him that make us a little uncomfortable. We tend to do that. If somebody's on our side, we tend to downplay, dismiss, excuse, overlook the glaring problems because they're on our side. And I don't know, that's something fundamentalists have to watch out for, because it's not just right belief. That's what they were fighting for. Right doctrine. Liberalism is an error. I agree 100%. But don't sacrifice character. In other words, it's about truth and it's about love. Okay? If you have the truth and you fight for the truth and you defend the truth and you uphold the truth, but you have not love, the Bible says you're missing something pretty significant. And unfortunately, that's some of the things that the early fundamentalists, and all the way down, fundamentalists were good about defending the truth a lot of the times, but they sometimes lacked love, even for each other. That was one of the problems, that after these fundamentalists came out of the big denominations, it's almost like they were so used to fighting that they turned to fighting each other. In other words, you're not fundamentalist enough. I'm more fundamentalist than you. And they started turning on one another, and that's why you have some of the splits. Like right after this, they break off from the denominations, and then they split from each other. You're like, what happened? Well, again, some of it might be personality, the egos, and things like that, but some of it may have been a lack of love. What does it say? You read and listen to this. This is 1 John. In 1 John, what does John talk about? He talks about truth, right? He certainly does. But John talks a lot about love. Listen to what he says. Chapter 5, verse 2. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and keep his commandments. And all throughout here, whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and whoever loves him, who loves him who is begotten of him. So loving God, but also, right, loving your neighbor. If you go back a few verses, if someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? So John would have a real problem with somebody if they denied the truth. But he would also have a real problem with somebody who didn't love. And so I don't think the fundamentalists get off guiltless, just because they stood for the truth. I think that's admirable. We need that. But we also need an emphasis on love as well. So right belief must be combined with right character. And there's more verses we could turn to see that. Number 2, beware of following men. Beware of following men. They will disappoint you. So if you were living in the 1920s and you were looking around and you said, I'm real concerned about liberalism. It's a big problem. I've read some booklets, I've read some articles and things, and man, they're denying biblical truth. So you decide, hey, I'm going to latch on to one of these preachers, to T.T. Shields or one of these others. And you say, I'm going to just follow them, read their books, listen to their radio program. Beware of that. Not that we can't learn. We should learn from preachers, teachers, books, all those things. But beware of getting locked into, especially where you follow somebody and you start to think about them, they could do no wrong, because people disappoint you. Somebody once said, I love studying church history because in church history, everybody's dead and they can't disappoint you anymore. And it's like, that's a good point, It's not like they're going to slip up and do something because they've been dead for several centuries. So yeah, there could be moral failure. But I'm afraid that there were some people who followed these people religiously. And that's dangerous. And that, again, is a symptom, or maybe a side effect, I guess I should say, that came out of fundamentalism too, which, there's a lot of things I appreciate about fundamentalism. But there is a sense in which some of these leaders made themselves the final authority. And people followed them just almost unquestioningly. And I got stories about that, but the point is, if you follow people, they're going to disappoint you. If you were a follower of Frank Norris, you could probably try to excuse some of his crazy antics to a degree, but just be careful about that. Number 3, separation. Separation is a necessary and frankly a biblical step to doctrinal and moral purity. Again, let me read to you from this time from 2 Corinthians. We started off tonight in 1 Corinthians. Now on to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. These are, again, I already kind of referenced these. He says here, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for verse 14. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness, and what accord with Christ with Belial? Or what has the believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of God, as God has said. And then he quotes from the Old Testament. So the question is posed there. It's kind of hypothetical, but what fellowship does light have with darkness? What does Christ have with Satan? What does an unbeliever have with a believer? And ultimately, I think that's what these fundamentalists were discovering, is we're unequally yoked. We're in these denominations that are Christian in name, and yet we don't share a common faith anymore. So I think separation is necessary and biblical step. Now, how far do you go with separation? How far do you separate? Well, that's a question we may talk about next time. Number 4, let us be known for our doctrinal conviction and our love, or love for one another, if you want to stick it in there. Again, if you just listen to the Apostle John, it's truth and love. Yeah, we should be known for standing for the truth, but if that's all we're known for, if that's all people can recognize, then I'm afraid there's something missing. Likewise, if all you're known for is being loving and not taking a stand on anything, then something's missing. Again, we're starting to point out some of the flaws, because so far I've been pretty positive towards fundamentalism, because these guys have been fighting the liberals, the unbelief. But tonight we kind of started, and then next week we'll get into sort of some of the side effects of fundamentalism and sort of the negative stereotype that's developed over time, and there's a reason for the stereotype. It's because some people have been just that way, kind of the dark side of fundamentalism, if you will. So we'll talk about that next time.